She was pretending to be his wife, standing beside Elliot Hale in front of everyone, her smile easy, his hand warm at the small of her back. She understood that somewhere in the past 6 weeks, the pretending had stopped. Not because anyone had found them out, because she had found herself out. She could not let it show, not here. Not in front of his staff, and his neighbors, and the people who had believed every part of this performance. If she looked at him now the way she actually wanted to, the whole of it would come apart. She kept her eyes forward. Then his hand shifted at her back. His thumb pressed once, steady and quiet, not a performance. The crowd was not watching that closely. Her breath caught such a small thing, the smallest possible thing. And it was the most real thing that had happened to her in 6 weeks. She did not look at him. But, under the harvest lanterns, with his hand warm and certain at her back, she finally stopped pretending she did not know what she felt. 6 weeks before the Harvest Festival lanterns were lit, Nora Callahan took a wrong turn through the East Gate. It was early, just past 7 in the morning. The Blue Ridge foothills were still wrapped in low mist that softened every edge of Hale Valley Estate, blurring the old stone fences into the vine rows. Nora had her leather satchel over one shoulder and a hand-drawn map in her coat pocket that she was increasingly certain she had misread. The path she had followed led away from the lavender beds, entirely and deep into the vineyard. She knew this because the light here was different. Lower amber, cutting through the vine leaves at an angle, that made her stop walking and simply look. She found the damaged row by accident. 4 or 5 vines with cracked cane supports, canopy drooping where it should have been reaching. The kind of thing you notice when you spent your professional life looking at living plants. She set her satchel down, knelt in the wet grass, and started adjusting the nearest support with her hands. She did not hear him approach. "That section is on my list for today," he said. She looked up. He was standing 4 feet away, tall and broad in a worn canvas jacket, dark hair with silver at the temples, arms loose at his sides. His expression was not unkind. It was simply contained, like a house with all the shutters closed on a day that was not cold enough to need them. "I did not damage anything," she said, straightening. She brushed the wet grass from her knees without hurry. The support was already failing. "I steadied it." He looked at the vine, then at her. "You are the illustrator," he said. "Nora Callahan, the Lavender Commission." She offered her hand. He shook it, brief and firm. "I took the wrong path. I will go back. The mist makes the east markers hard to read early." He said it without blame. "I will walk you to the lavender beds." They walked without much conversation. He mentioned which varieties were oldest, which had been replanted after a late frost 3 years back. He spoke about the plants the way she drew them, with precision and without sentimentality. She listened and said almost nothing, which seemed to suit them both. At the edge of the lavender field he stopped. "The damaged row," he said. "How did you know to adjust the angle, instead of just retying it?" She looked at him. It was a genuine question, not conversational, not polite. He actually wanted to know. "The cane was still flexible," she said. "Retying a flexible cane to a rigid post at the wrong angle creates more stress over time, not less. Better to let it find its natural line first." Something moved across his face. Small and brief there, and gone before she could name it. He nodded once and left her at the lavender field. She stood still for a moment after he went, watching him walk back into the mist. He was reserved in a way that was not coldness. It was something more deliberate than that. A man who had decided somewhere in his history that the safest way to move through the world was quietly, carefully, and with both hands occupied. She had spent 2 years learning what it felt like to live without that kind of quiet purpose. She was not prepared for how clearly she recognized it in him. She worked through the morning. The varieties, the root systems, the small, careful decisions of documentation. By mid-morning, the estate was fully alive around her. Workers in the vineyard, equipment somewhere beyond the tree line. She was packing her kit when she glanced back toward the damaged row. Elliot was still there, working methodically down the line, resetting each support with the same unhurried attention he seemed to bring to everything. He did not look up. She closed her satchel and walked toward the cottage. But something had lodged in her attention and refused to release. Not the estate. Not the light on the vines. Him, the particular way he moved through this. Land as if every row and every crumbling stone wall were his direct responsibility. Not a burden, a purpose. That evening she laid out her morning's work on the desk in the cottage. She looked at it for a while. Then she pulled out a rough pencil sketch she had made, without quite deciding to. The damaged vine row, the cane at the corrected angle, the canopy beginning to reach toward where the light would come. It was not part of her commission. She had not even registered drawing it. She placed it in the back of her portfolio and closed the cover. She did not take it out again that night. But she did not throw it away either. The following morning, Nora was crouched in the lavender beds when the old farmhand appeared. His name was Gus. She had seen him the previous afternoon from a distance, moving along the irrigation lines with the careful economy of someone who had done the same work for 40 years. He was carrying 2 heavy water tanks when she saw him again, one in each hand, walking at an angle that told her one shoulder had been giving him trouble for some time. She stood, walked over, and took one of the tanks without comment. He looked at her with mild surprise, then a small weathered smile. "You are here to draw," he said. "The east row is exactly where I am working next," she told him, which was only partly true. They walked together. Gus talked the way people who have loved a place for a long time tend to talk about it, not with large stories but with small specific ones. The way the light moved across the lavender in late August, the winter the late frost came, and they worked through the night covering the most vulnerable vines by hand. The way the harvest felt differently now than it had when Elliot's father was alive. He was a good man, Gus said. She was not certain which man he meant. She had the sense he meant both. She did not notice Elliot until she turned to retrieve her satchel. He was standing at the edge of the field, watching, not watching her work, watching her with the tank and Gus. When her eyes found him, he did not look away. He held her gaze for one quiet moment. Then he turned back to the equipment line he had been checking. Something about being seen doing a simple thing by someone who noticed it felt different than it should have. She returned to the lavender. 20 minutes passed. "Coffee," he said. From behind her, she looked up. He was standing with 2 mugs, holding one toward her. "Black, but I brought cream if you need it." "Black is fine." She accepted the mug. "Thank you." He crouched beside the row, not intrusively, just present, looking at the lavender. She had the sense he was not quite ready to leave, and did not quite know what to do about that. It was unexpectedly endearing in a man who otherwise seemed to know exactly where he stood in every room he entered. They were quiet for a moment, comfortable quiet, the kind that does not need to be filled. "Most of the people here have been on this land a long time," he said finally, looking at the lavender, not at her. "They stayed because they wanted to, not because they had to. That matters to me." She looked at him. He was still not looking at her, and somehow that made it easier to understand what he meant by it. He was not talking about loyalty in the abstract. He was talking about something he had needed to believe, and had at some point stopped being entirely sure of. "That vine I studied yesterday," she said. "Did you check it this morning?" A pause. Something around his mouth that was almost something. "Yes." And, holding better than the others, he stood and looked down at her, with that same contained expression. "You have a good eye." He left her with the coffee and did not look back. She remained crouched at the lavender bed, holding the warm mug with both hands. The morning was cool and the light was long across the rows, and she told herself firmly, simply noticing the quality of the air. She was not thinking about the particular way he had delivered those words, as if he did not hand out observations carelessly and wanted her to understand the weight of them. She was absolutely thinking about it. Later, a brief warm rain moved through, and she sheltered under the stone overhang at the edge of the field and watched it pass in silver curtains over the lavender. She thought about the estate, and the work and the careful accumulated evidence of years of tending visible in everything she looked at here. She thought about what it would feel like to be the kind of person who built something like this. Something that held she had been moving for 2 years. Light, portable, careful not to put down anything she would later have to leave. She picked up her pencil and began to draw, and did not let herself think about it further. It stayed with her, quiet and inconvenient, all the way through the afternoon. The morning Margaret Hale arrived. The sky had dropped 10 degrees overnight, and the air tasted of rain that had not yet fallen. Nora was in the lavender beds at the usual hour when she heard the cars. She paid little attention at first, but something about the deliberate, unhurried crunch of gravel under tires that expected to be noticed made her look up. The first car through the main gate was dark and large and expensive. A second followed, then a third. She returned to her work. Elliot found her 40 minutes later. She knew it was him before he spoke. The particular quality of his footsteps, measured and direct, had already become familiar to her over the 3 days she had been on the estate. He stopped 2 rows away, Nora. His voice was even. I need to speak with you. She looked up. Something behind his expression was taut in a way she had not seen before. Come up to the house, he said. Please. She capped her pen and followed him. He told her in the kitchen, standing with his back to the window and his hands flat on the counter. His Aunt Margaret had arrived with a potential buyer named Richard Aldcroft and 2 legal advisors. Margaret was a co-trustee of the estate. She had the legal standing to call a formal review of the estate's management. She believed Elliot was unfit to manage Gila Valley alone, that his isolation would result in mismanagement, and that the right buyer could preserve the family's assets more efficiently than Elliot's attachment to the land allowed. She is looking for any evidence that I cannot manage this responsibly, he said. A man alone on an estate this size at my age, with no family structure in place, gives her a strong argument for intervention. Nora stood across the kitchen and listened. The commission can continue, he said. Nothing about your work here changes, but I need to ask you something, and I will understand completely if you say no. He looked at her directly. I need someone to be here as my wife for the duration of the harvest. 6 weeks. That is all. Margaret leaves after the harvest festival, once she has seen the estate functioning well. I know it is an enormous thing to ask of someone I have known for 3 days. The kitchen was very quiet. Nora thought about the vine she had studied on her first morning, the way he had walked back to check it himself, the way Gus had talked about this land with 40 years of loyalty in his voice, the way the estate was not property to the man standing across from her. It was the whole of something that mattered. She thought about her own situation, the depleted savings, the months of work that had barely kept her moving, after she had finally walked away from a relationship that had cost her more than money. The commission here was the largest she had received in 2 years. My illustrations stay with me, she said. My work continues on schedule, of course, and the commission is paid in full regardless of how this arrangement ends. Agreed. I will put it in writing today. She held his gaze for a moment longer. All right, she said. Something in him settled. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than relief. Thank you, he said. Dinner that first evening was the beginning of the performance. Margaret Hale was elegantly built and sharp-eyed, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades locating weaknesses in other people's positions. Richard Aldcroft was polite and largely silent. The legal advisor said almost nothing at all. Elliot introduced Nora as his wife. He said it naturally, with his hand at her elbow. She matched his tone without hesitation, and was surprised honestly by how little effort it required. She was also surprised by the way Margaret studied her throughout dinner, careful and measuring, like someone running a calculation she expected to come out in her favor. Over dessert, Margaret asked how they had met. At a heritage botanical exhibition in Charlottesville, Nora said she had not rehearsed this. It came from the same instinct that had made her study the vine without being asked. He was looking at a lavender illustration that I had just sold to someone else. I had to apologize. Elliot turned to look at her. Something small and warm moved through his expression. She told me I had terrible timing, he said. I said your timing was inconvenient, she corrected mildly. There is a difference. Margaret watched the exchange with an expression that was not quite satisfied and not quite suspicious. Somewhere precisely between the two. Later, after the guests had retired, Nora sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and thought about the 6 weeks ahead. The lie, the work, the estate. The man who had asked her for something with such directness and honesty that it had been almost impossible to say no to. She went to bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The next 6 weeks were going to be more complicated than she had accounted for. 2 weeks into the arrangement, Nora learned that Elliot Hale did not sleep enough. She learned this the way she learned most things, by observation rather than asking. He was the first person moving through the house every morning, before dawn, checking weather reports and irrigation schedules and harvest projections before the rest of the estate had woken. He was also the last to rest, often walking the vineyard after dinner with a lantern and his own company. She did not comment on it. It was not her place. But on an evening 11 days after Margaret's arrival, he came in from the far fields, 2 hours later than usual. The harvest crew had found a problem with the irrigation pump in the southwest corner, and he had stayed to manage it himself. He came into the kitchen smelling of field dirt and engine oil, his canvas jacket damp across the shoulders, moving with the particular stillness of someone who was very tired and refusing to acknowledge it. The kitchen was empty. She had already eaten. She had also, without giving herself time to deliberate about it, left a covered plate on the counter. The thick vegetable soup the estate cook had made that afternoon, still warm, a mug of something hot beside it. Bread with a cloth over it. She was at the kitchen table with her sketchbook when he came in. She did not look up from her work. He saw the plate immediately. He stood looking at it for a moment without moving. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. She kept her eyes on her sketch. He sat at the table. She heard him lift the cloth from the bread, heard the quiet sounds of someone eating. She continued drawing. The presence of another person in the kitchen at that hour should have felt intrusive. It did not. It felt strangely like the right arrangement. After a while, he said quietly, "The pump is fixed." "Good," she said. Another silence. Comfortable in a way that neither of them seemed to know what to do with. "My father used to do this," Elliot said. The words came slowly and measured, like something he was deciding to say, rather than something that had simply arrived. "Leave food out," he said. A person who had worked that long in a field deserved to come home to something warm. She looked up then. He was looking at the bowl in his hands, not at her. "He sounds like he understood things clearly," she said. He did a pause. "More than I gave him credit for." When he was alive, she could hear what lived underneath those words without needing him to say it plainly. The particular grief of understanding things too late. "My grandmother used to say that the best way to love someone was to notice what they needed before they had to ask," Nora said. She returned to her sketch as she said it gently, like setting something down rather than presenting it. "I did not fully understand it until I was old enough to see what it cost her, how much attention it required, how much it asked of her every single day." He was quiet for a long time. "Yes," he said finally. "Just that one word." She closed her sketchbook when he was nearly finished. She said goodnight without ceremony, left him with the warm kitchen and the lamp burning low, and walked down the hall to her room. She did not hear him move from the table for a long time after she left. She lay in the dark and pressed one hand against her chest and acknowledged, clearly and without drama, that this arrangement was going to be considerably harder to maintain than she had initially calculated. Not because of the pretending. Because the parts that were not pretending were becoming very difficult to distinguish from the parts that were. And she was no longer entirely certain which category the warmth she felt right now belonged to. She closed her eyes and let the house settle around her and did not allow herself to think about it further. She was not entirely successful. She thought about what her grandmother had said about noticing what someone needed before they had to ask. She had always assumed that was a description of love in its domestic form, the small practical kindnesses of a long partnership. She had not considered that it might also be the way you recognized something in another person when you were not looking for it and had not planned for it to matter. She pulled the blanket up and pressed her face into the pillow and decided firmly that this was simply the natural consequence of a sustained performance. That caring about someone you spent every day with was not evidence of anything except proximity. She was not entirely convinced by this either, but it was enough to let her sleep. Serena arrived on a Friday 4 days after Margaret. Nora did not know who she was at first. She saw a woman stepping out of a sleek silver car in the drive. Late afternoon, heels deliberate on the gravel. Dark hair smooth and arranged in a way that suggested significant effort made to look effortless. She was beautiful in the way of someone who had spent a long time perfecting the performance of it. Margaret met her at the door. Nora was at the east window of the sitting room, finishing a detail on one of her lavender plates, when she heard their greetings. She returned to her work. Elliot told her before dinner, quietly, while the others were still being seated. "My former fiancé," he said. His voice did not change at all. Margaret invited her. She and Aldcroft have mutual business connections. Nora did not respond immediately. She felt him watching her peripheral vision. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I thought you should know before you were in the same room with her." She looked at him then briefly. His expression was very careful. Braced, she thought. The way a person stands when they are expecting something they have no way to avoid. She reached across the space between them and rested her hand over his on the table, briefly and without announcement. He went still, then dinner began. Serena was not openly hostile. That was the more difficult thing. She was warm and polished and precise, asking Nora questions about her work, with bright interest, complimenting the estate, laughing easily at the right moments. She wore her intelligence the way she wore everything else, as an advantage. But twice during the meal she made observations that landed with the specific weight of something calculated. Once about the impracticality of a freelance life, with a small, sympathetic smile. Once about how unexpected it was that someone as private as Elliot had married so quietly, without any of his oldest friends present. "We were not trying to make an announcement," Nora said, the second time. Her voice was easy and unhurried. "We just did not see the point in making something simple into something complicated." Elliot was watching her. She could feel it without looking. Serena smiled. "Of course," she said. "How refreshing." After dinner, Margaret suggested a walk through the vineyard in the last of the evening light. Aldcroft and the advisors went along. Serena moved ahead on the path, and Nora found herself walking at Elliot's side with no clear sense of when they had moved toward each other. At the far end of the vine row, she heard Serena speaking to Aldcroft about the estate's production capacity. Her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who had once had access to detailed financial information about this place. The precision of it was unmistakable. She felt Elliot slow beside her. Just slightly. She glanced up. His jaw was tight. His eyes were on the path ahead, but she could see the restraint it cost him to keep walking steadily, to keep his posture easy, to hold all of it inside that quiet, contained exterior. "She took documents when she left," he said very quietly. "For her alone, 3 years ago. Financial projections, irrigation costs, vintage records. She used them to approach a competing buyer with an interest in this region." Nora was quiet for a moment. "And Margaret still invited her," she said. "Margaret does not know the full extent of it." A pause. "Or chooses not to." She thought about that for the rest of the walk. Later, after the guests had gone inside, she stood alone in the garden for a moment. She thought about Serena's polished precision and everything underneath it. She thought about what it meant to have someone extract the detailed knowledge of your most vulnerable places and use it as leverage. She thought about Elliot, walking back through the vine, rose with his jaw tight and his posture steady, refusing to let any of it show. She thought about what he had said at dinner, easy and without particular drama. When Serena had let her small observation about freelance life sit with just a fraction too much silence after it. He had said, simply, "Nora built her career entirely on her own terms. I have always respected that more than almost anything else about her." It was not a grand defense. It was a plain, measured truth. Delivered the way he said everything that mattered, without performance, without needing anyone to notice. And it had landed somewhere in her chest with a warmth she had not been prepared for. She went inside before she let herself think about it further. 3 weeks into the arrangement, on a night when the rain had driven everyone inside, and the fire in the main sitting room was the warmest place in the house, they were alone for the first time since the arrangement began. Margaret had retired early. Aldcroft had gone to make calls. Serena had disappeared somewhere after dinner, with the quiet efficiency of someone who always had a secondary plan. Nora was at the far end of the sitting room with her field notes, cross-referencing that morning's sketches against the heritage documentation she had been given on arrival. Elliot was in the armchair near the fire with the estate ledgers, doing what she now knew he did most evenings, running the numbers quietly, while everything else settled into silence around him. The rain on the windows was heavy and steady. After an hour, the fire crackled lower. She did not notice the chill creeping through the room until she felt it in her fingers. She set her notes down and sat back. Her shawl had slipped from her shoulders at some point and pooled on the cushion behind her. She reached for it without looking. "Here," he said. He was standing beside the sofa. She had not heard him move. He had the shawl in his hands, and he settled it around her shoulders, with the same unhurried care he gave to everything on this estate. His fingers barely grazed the fabric at her collarbone as he placed it. She went very still. He did not step back immediately. He remained where he was, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the cedar and earth scent of him, the particular quality of his stillness in that moment. "Cold," he said. It was not a question. "I did not notice," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. He sat on the edge of the sofa, not far from her, not in the armchair. He picked up his ledger, but did not immediately open it. "How is the documentation progressing?" he asked. "Well, better than I expected." She shifted to face him slightly. "The Munstead variety near the north wall is older than the records show." I believe you may have plants that predate your great-grandmother's original planting. If that is confirmed, the heritage value is significant. My father always said the oldest lavender was near the north wall, he said. He believed some of it had been growing there since the original farmstead, before the estate was formalized. He may have been right. The root structure on 2 of those plants suggests something much older than 40 years. He turned to look at her then, fully, and for a moment the ledger and the fire and the rain on the glass all existed at the far edges of a smaller, more specific space. Just the 2 of them and the quiet thing happening between them that neither of them had named yet. He would have liked that, Elliot said. His voice was lower than usual. Knowing the records confirmed what he believed. The records do not always confirm what is true, she said gently. Sometimes the plants themselves are the more reliable document. He was still looking at her. A long, unhurried look that was not searching for anything and not performing anything, and was precisely, she thought, what his eyes looked like when he was simply being honest. That is true of more than plants, he said. She became aware, slowly, and all at once, that the shawl he had placed around her shoulders was still warm from his hands. She did not move closer. He did not either. But the space between them had changed without either of them changing it, had compressed into something smaller and more weighted, and she understood from the particular quality of his stillness that he felt it too. "Good night, Nora," he said finally. He stood and returned to his chair. Opened the ledger. "Good night," she said. She returned to her field notes and stared at them for a long time without reading a single word. The fire settled lower. The rain kept on. And in the quiet sitting room, with the careful usual distance between them restored, something that had not been there before remained. Hanging in the warm air like the last note of something ending, and the first note of something else entirely. She turned a page in her notebook and pressed her pencil to paper and did not try to name it. Some things needed more time to become themselves. The conversation happened on a Tuesday evening, when the harvest was 3 weeks away, and the estate had entered that particular rhythm of controlled urgency that Nora had come to recognize as Elliot's natural register. He asked her to walk with him at dusk, not framed around the arrangement or estate logistics. Just, "Would you walk with me?" and nothing else. She said yes without thinking about it. He took her to the oldest part of the vineyard, the north-facing slope that his grandfather had planted in 1961. The vines now thick and gnarled and tremendously alive, the kind of growth that can only come from 60 years of tended care and good soil, and enough peace to take root. "My grandfather planted every single one of these himself," Elliot said, moving slowly between the rows. "By hand. My father helped as a boy. He told me about it once. Said it was the first thing he had ever done that he was entirely certain would outlast him." She walked beside him, her hands in her coat pockets. The light was fading to rose and blue along the ridgeline. The air was cool up here, the vines giving off the particular green-dark scent of plants that had been growing in one place for a very long time. "That is a remarkable inheritance," she said. "It is." He paused beside an especially old vine, thick as a young tree at the base, and rested his hand against it for a moment. A gesture she had seen him make before. Not dramatic, just present, acknowledging "I almost lost it." He said she waited. "Serena had access to 10 years of financial projections," he said. "When she left, she took them. Used them to make a case to a regional investment group that the estate was underperforming relative to its market value. That if I continued managing it the way I had been, a buyer could acquire it below valuation within 3 years. He said all of it quietly, looking at the vine, not at her. "She was not wrong about the numbers," he said. "She was wrong about what the numbers meant. They did not account for what was being built here, what was still growing." A pause. "I should have seen what she was earlier. I thought she understood this place. I think now she was always calculating something. Being deceived by someone you chose to trust is not a failure of intelligence," Nora said. "It is a failure of theirs." He finally looked at her. His expression was open in a way she had not seen before, unguarded and careful at the same time. Like someone opening a door they were not certain they should open, but could not make themselves leave closed. "You are very direct," he said. "So are you," she said. "You said what she did plainly, without making it more than it was. That is directness. I was just returning it." They reached the low stone wall at the top of the slope and stopped. The valley spread below them in the last of the light, the estate like a painting of itself. The stone house and the vine rows and the lavender fields and the cottages, everything quiet and whole and exactly where it should be. He was standing close beside her. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through her coat. She was looking at the valley. And then she was aware that he was looking at her. She turned. He was much closer than the arrangement required, and his eyes were doing something she recognized now, that particular honest attention, but directed at her differently than it had ever been directed at anything else. He leaned in slowly, gave her every moment to move away. She did not move away. His mouth found hers softly. Briefly, almost a question, barely there and then gone. His breath warm against her lips afterward, both of them very still in the evening air. He pulled back. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I did not plan that." Her heartbeat was in her throat. "You do not need to apologize." He looked at her with that open, uncertain expression for another moment. Then he turned back to the valley. They walked back separately. Not by design exactly. She stopped to look at something in a vine row, and he kept walking, and the distance between them grew naturally, and remained. In the dark of the cottage, she pressed her fingertips to her mouth and stood very still for a long time. She had been pretending to be someone's wife for 3 weeks, and that had been, until this moment, the strangest thing that had happened to her in recent memory. It was no longer the strangest thing. The storm moved in fast on a Thursday afternoon in late September. The kind of weather the Blue Ridge generates without much warning. A wall of dark cloud pushing in from the northwest with cold air and sudden wind, and rain that started heavy, and did not lighten. Nora was in the far lavender beds, the section nearest the north wall, when she felt the temperature drop. She had been so absorbed in documenting the oldest plants that she had not checked the sky in over an hour. By the time she looked up, the storm was close, and her materials were spread across both documentation tables and the nearest shelter. Was the old equipment shed at the far edge of the field. She ran. She made the shed just as the rain came down in earnest, pulling the door shut behind her and pressing against the back wall while the storm hit. The roof, with the specific fury of weather that has been building for a while and is finally allowed to arrive. She was not soaked through. Her jacket had taken most of it. She set her satchel on the workbench, shook the water from her hair, and laughed once involuntarily, the way you do when you have only narrowly avoided something. The shed door opened 10 minutes later. Elliot came in with rain streaming from his jacket and his hair dark and flat with water, carrying her documentation kit that she had left out on the table. He had come through the full force of the storm to retrieve her materials before they were ruined. He was very wet. She stared at him. "The papers," he said, by way of explanation. He set the kit on the workbench beside her satchel. "The rain would have damaged them." "You ran through the whole field," she said. "The documentation matters." He was breathing a little fast. He looked at her briefly. "Are you all right?" "I am fine." "You are drenched." "I have been wetter." He turned to look out the small window at the storm, which was not letting up. The shed was small. 2 workbenches, some wall-mounted tools, a shelf of spare irrigation hardware, large enough to work in. He did not move further away. She did not either. "Thank you," she said. "For the papers, they are important." He turned back from the window. He was looking at her with that unguarded attention that had been more visible since Tuesday evening, the one he seemed unable to fully close back down again. She reached up and brushed the rain from his jaw with the backs of her fingers. She did not plan it. Her hand was simply there before she caught up with what she was doing. His breath changed. She meant to pull back, but his hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his face, large and warm, and very gently holding it there. The rain was loud on the roof, and the shed was warm with both of them in it, and she was aware of nothing else in the world except the space between them. "Nora," he said, low and careful and entirely certain. She closed the distance. This kiss was not brief. It was not almost a question. It was slow and thorough and conscious and warm. His hands coming to her face, and then to her shoulders, her hands at his jacket, the rain entirely forgotten. It was the kind of kiss that acknowledged what had been building for a long time, and was finally allowed to be exactly what it was. When they finally pulled back, the storm was still going. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Nothing contained about it, nothing guarded, something much more open than either of those things, much more uncertain, and much more real. She pressed her hand flat against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat. Neither of them said anything. They waited out the storm in the small shed with their shoulders close together and the rain deciding things above them. And when it finally cleared and the sun came back through in low, golden bands, they walked back through the wet lavender fields together, They did not hold hands, but they walked closer than they had before. And she knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with any arrangement, that something had shifted that could not be shifted back. Nora heard her before she saw her, the specific click of heels on the stone path that Serena seemed to wear as a kind of announcement. She kept working. "These are lovely," Serena said, stopping at the edge of the row and looking at the lavender with a measured appreciation. She applied to everything on the estate. The illustrations. "I saw some of them drying in the hall." "Thank you," Nora said. Serena was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for her. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, smaller, almost reasonable. "I am not here to cause trouble," she said. "I want you to know that." Nora did not respond to this. "I know what this arrangement is," Serena said, her voice careful and level. "I am not interested in exposing anything. But I think as two women who have both known Elliot, we might understand something that the arrangement itself does not allow for." "What would that be?" Nora asked. Her voice was even. "He is not capable of choosing someone," Serena said. "Not permanently, not freely. He chooses the estate every single time. I realized that too late. I do not want the same thing to happen to you." Nora looked at her then fully, for the first time in the conversation. Serena's expression was composed, measured, almost kind, in the way of someone who had practiced the appearance of kindness until it was nearly indistinguishable from the real thing. "I appreciate the concern," Nora said. She returned to her work. She said nothing more. Serena eventually left, but something lodged in her chest like a splinter that she could not pull out cleanly. A voice that said, "You are here because of an arrangement. You are here because he needed something and you had nothing better to go to. And when the arrangement ends, so do you. You are not the kind of person who stays in a place like this. You have never been the kind of person who stays." She tried to set it aside. She could not entirely set it aside. That evening she was quieter than usual. She ate dinner, answered the questions the performance required, sat in the sitting room for the appropriate amount of time. But she was behind glass in a way she had not been in weeks. Aware of the distance she was reinstating, and unable to fully say why she needed it right now, only that she did. Elliot noticed, of course he noticed. He noticed everything about this estate, and he had, over the past 4 weeks, begun to notice everything about her, with the same thorough, unhurried attention. He said nothing directly. But she caught him watching her twice during dinner with that contained expression returned to his face, the shuttered one, and she understood that her withdrawal had communicated something to him, efficiently, and without ambiguity, in the language of someone who had been quietly waiting for exactly this signal. The next 2 days were careful and polite, and cold in the way that things become cold when warmth has been present and has drawn back. He was not unkind. He was never unkind. In every performance required of them, in every quiet evening that no longer felt easy the way it had begun to feel easy. She lay in bed at the end of the second night, with her hand pressed flat on the mattress beside her, and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Serena had said, about what this arrangement was and what it was not, about the line between pretending and meaning it, which had become so blurred she could not locate it clearly anymore. She had walked away from a relationship that had diminished her slowly over years. She had done it because she had finally understood that the cost of staying was her own integrity. She did not want to make a different version of the same mistake, for different reasons, with the man who had never promised her anything except 6 weeks and the payment of a commission. She stared at the ceiling. Across the hall, she was almost certain Elliot Hale was doing exactly the same thing, and she was equally certain that neither of them, separately, was arriving at the right conclusion. The meeting happened on a Thursday, 1 week before the Harvest Festival. Margaret had arranged it efficiently, and without much warning. The estate solicitor joined by telephone. Aldcroft was present in the room. 2 co-trustees Nora had not previously met joined by video call on the large screen in the sitting room. Elliot was in the far fields. He had been given a different time. Nora understood this. When she walked into the sitting room and saw the assembled faces, and the particular quality of satisfaction on Margaret's expression, sharp and ready, the look of someone who has been waiting to say something for a very long time and has finally been given the appropriate venue. Serena was not in the room, but her presence was in it regardless. Margaret laid it out directly. She had received documentation confirming that Nora Callahan had arrived at Hale Valley, a state on a freelance botanical commission for a regional heritage publication. that she had no established prior relationship with Elliot Hale before arriving on the property, that the marriage therefore was either extremely recent and undisclosed, or was not what it appeared to be. The room waited. Nora stood at the edge of it with her hands at her sides and her posture easy and straight. She thought about what she could say. There were things she could construct. She had been constructing things for 6 weeks, but she looked at the faces in the room and she thought about what it had cost her to walk away from her previous relationship with her integrity intact, and she thought about what it would cost to compromise that integrity now, and she understood that she would not do it. Not for an arrangement, not for anything. "I arrived as a commissioned botanical illustrator," she said. Her voice was quiet and completely steady. "That is accurate." The room exhaled. "What happened after that," she continued, "is not something I am able to explain to a committee, and I will not try to." She looked at Margaret directly, without hostility, and without apology. Then she excused herself and walked out. She packed methodically. She was good at moving quickly. All of them. She wrapped them in tissue paper and placed them in the flat portfolio case. But one she took out again. The sketch from the very first morning, before anything had happened, before any arrangement or any lie or any harvest lanterns. The rough pencil drawing of the damaged vine row in the vineyard. The one she had studied without being asked. The cane at the corrected angle. The canopy beginning to reach toward the light. She carried it to the study and placed it on his desk, face up, where he would see it when he came in. She did not leave a note. There was nothing she could have written that would have said it more cleanly than that drawing already said it. Gus was crossing the far end of the drive and stopped when he saw her. She looked at him for a moment. He looked at her. Something passed between them that required no words and that she would think about for a long time afterward. She drove down the long gravel road without looking in the rearview mirror. She drove slowly, very slowly. She stopped once, just past the edge of the estate road, where the gravel gave way to asphalt and the fields opened up into the wider valley. She sat with the engine running and the windows down and the afternoon air moving through the car. She could see the ridgeline from here, the same ridge she had looked at from the stone wall the evening he had kissed her for the first time. It looked the same as it had then. Everything outside her looked exactly the same. She pulled back onto the road and kept going. The town was 20 minutes away. The small inn she had seen on her way in 6 weeks ago had a vacancy sign, and a porch with 2 chairs on it, and the smell of something baking coming from somewhere nearby. She checked in without much conversation, and sat in the front parlor with her coat still on, and ordered tea she did not particularly want. She set her portfolio on the floor beside her chair, and put her hands in her lap and sat. With the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision they are not certain was the right one. And who knows? Regardless that it was the honest one. And she was sitting in the small inn at the edge of town, suitcase beside her chair, a cup of tea cooling in front of her, when the door opened and she looked up. He had come directly from the fields. She could tell by his canvas jacket still carrying dust, and the particular red clay of the far hillside plots on his boots. He had driven down without stopping to change, without any of the planning and deliberate care he usually brought to everything. The urgency of it was unlike him, and entirely like him, in the way that contradictions sometimes made sudden, complete sense. He stood in the doorway of the inn, and found her at the corner table. Something moved through his face when he saw her. Relief and something else that was considerably harder to name. He sat down across from her without being invited. He set his hands flat on the table between them. She looked at his hands, then at his face. "I found the drawing," he said. She said nothing. "The vine," he said, "from the first morning, before any of this. Before I asked you for anything." His voice was lower than usual, and rougher at the edges, the way voices go when something has been pressing upward for a long time. "You studied it before you knew it mattered to me. You drew it before it was any part of your commission. You kept it in your portfolio for 6 weeks, and left it on my desk when you walked out." She wrapped both hands around her tea. "I spent 5 years after Serena believing that the people who came to this estate came for what it was worth," he said. "What they could extract from it. I was not wrong about the specific people I was choosing. But I started applying the same rule to everyone, which was wrong. Which was, I think, the part that was actually hurting me more than anything Serena ever did." Nora was quiet. "You came here on a commission," he said. "That is true. And I asked you to extend your stay under false pretenses, which put you in an impossible position. And I am aware of that. And I have been watching you for 6 weeks tend to things that no one asked you to tend. Speak plainly when you could have performed. Care for people, and for this land in ways that had nothing to do with the arrangement, and everything to do with who you actually are. He paused. And I let myself believe, when you pulled back last week, that I had been wrong about you. His jaw tightened. I was not wrong about you. I was frightened. And I used your distance as a reason to retreat to the place I understand better than this one, because it felt safer than admitting what I was actually afraid of. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Serena's voice in the lavender field. About the splinter of doubt she had carried for 10 days like a bruise she kept pressing. She thought about the vine she had studied on the first morning because it was struggling, and she had the means to help, and there was no particular reason not to. She thought about running her hands over the edges of a lie she had agreed to, for practical reasons, and finding something she had not agreed to and could not quite set down. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He looked down at it. Then he turned his hand over and closed it around hers, and when he looked up at her, there was nothing contained about his expression. It was completely open, uncertain, and exactly, she thought, what honesty looks like when it has nothing left to protect. "Stay," he said. Quiet, direct, costing him something visible. She held his gaze. "Ask me without the arrangement," she said. He understood immediately. He let out a slow breath. "Will you stay?" he said. "Because I want you here. Because this estate is more itself when you are in it. Because I have been trying to talk myself out of this for 6 weeks. And I am finished trying." She stood from the table. He stood too. She kissed him first this time. It was slow and warm and fully conscious. Nothing uncertain in it. Nothing that was not exactly what they both meant by it. His arms came around her, and she felt the tension go out of him like something releasing after a very long hold. And she pressed one hand flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and real and present, and thought, there it is. There is the truth of it. They stood in the quiet corner of the small inn, with the late afternoon light coming through the windows, and neither of them seemed in any hurry to move. Outside, the Blue Ridge was going gold. The harvest was 4 days away. The harvest festival came and went, and it was everything the estate had prepared for it to be. Margaret, facing the unanimous testimony of Hale Valley's long-standing staff, and the solicitor's legal assessment that the review had insufficient grounds to proceed, agreed to step back from active oversight. She did not do it with particular grace, but she did it, and she did not contest the estate's management again. Serena did not return. Nora's illustrations were published in the Regional Heritage Documentation the following spring, a 40-page record of the Hale Valley lavender varieties and their historical lineage. The finding about the Northwall Munstead variety, confirmed by an independent botanist, was noted in the journal as potentially the oldest documented lavender root system in the Blue Ridge region. The photograph that ran alongside the article showed the stone fence and the mountains beyond. The caption read simply, "Hale Valley Estate, Virginia, planted before the records began." Elliot had it framed. Nora moved into the largest of the tenant cottages in October, the one with the east-facing window that caught the morning light first. She kept her portfolio there, and her field kit, and the small, specific accumulation of things that told the story of a life spent paying close attention to living things. She also kept a key to the main house on her keyring. She had not planned to keep it. He had set it on the kitchen table one morning beside his coffee without announcement, and she had picked it up without comment, and it had been there ever since. The first winter at Hale Valley was quieter than she had expected, and more full than she had been in a very long time. They worked in comfortable proximity, her illustrations and his ledgers, her field notes and his harvest records. Breakfast together almost every morning, walks in the evenings when the light allowed. Sometimes Gus joined them, and the three of them moved through the dormant vine rows in easy company, talking about nothing in particular, which was the best kind of company, and that he laughed less frequently than most people, but that when he did, it changed his face, completely in a way that made her want to say something that would make him laugh again. He learned that she was more restless than she appeared, and that she talked to the plants when she thought no one was listening, and that she cried at certain passages in certain books and was entirely unapologetic about it. They were careful with each other in the ways that mattered, and easy with each other in ways she had not experienced in a very long time. In February, on a morning when the estate sat quietly under a thin winter frost, she was at the kitchen table with her coffee, and a new commission spread before her, When he came in from checking the vine rows, he poured his own coffee. He sat across from her. He looked at her for a moment with that particular steady attention that still 7 months in made her slightly unsteady in the best possible way. Then he said, "I love you." Simply, quietly, without preamble or build-up. The way he said most things that were true. She looked up at him. She had known it for a long time. Since the equipment shed, possibly. Or since the first morning with the damaged vine, if she was being fully honest with herself. But hearing it in his voice, plain and deliberate, and entirely without pretense, landed differently than knowing it had. "I love you," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the warm kitchen, with the frost on the windows and the coffee going cool between them, and the whole of the estate quiet and safe outside. She thought about a woman who had arrived at the wrong gate on a misty morning with a leather satchel and a hand-drawn map. She had misread and no particular plan for what came next. She thought about a man who moved through his land as if every living thing on it was his direct responsibility, and who had, without quite meaning to, become her direct responsibility in return. She thought about roots that grow slowly and hold for a very long time. Outside the kitchen window, the vine rows were bare and waiting. At the far end of the estate, the oldest lavender was already putting out new growth along the base, patient and certain and entirely sure of where it belonged. So was she. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like and subscribe. It costs nothing and means everything for the channel. I would love to hear from you. On a scale of 0 to 10, how did this story make you feel? Drop your rating in the comments. I read every single one. I am truly grateful you are here. See you in the next story.